In 1886, a wounded Confederate veteran named John Pemberton was desperately stirring chemicals in a cramped Atlanta laboratory. He wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to escape the grip of morphine. During the Civil War, Pemberton had been slashed by a cavalry saber so badly that the pain never fully left. For years afterwards, he had relied on morphine just to function. And by the 1880s, the addiction had consumed him. His answer was to brew a new kind of tonic, one that combined coca leaf extract, the raw source of cocaine, with caffeine from the African cola nut. He marketed it as a cure for headaches, exhaustion, nervous disorders, and even morphine addiction itself. He called it Coca-Cola. In its very first year of sale at a single Atlanta pharmacy, it brought in exactly $50 in revenue, against $70 in expenses, a net loss, a failure by every measure. 2 years later, Pemberton died of stomach cancer, still addicted, still broke, still convinced his invention would amount to nothing. But someone else saw what Pemberton couldn't. A sharp-eyed Atlanta pharmacist named Asa Candler had been watching Coca-Cola closely. Through a murky series of transactions, some of which historians still debate, Candler managed to acquire the entire formula, the brand, and the trademark for roughly $2,300, a laughable sum, even by the standards of the 1880s. But what Candler understood, and what Pemberton never grasped, was that the liquid inside the bottle didn't matter nearly as much as the story wrapped around it. Candler didn't just sell syrup. He flooded Atlanta with free sample coupons, plastered the city with banners and streetcar placards, hired people to hand out Coca-Cola at every public gathering they could find, and printed the now famous Spencerian script logo on everything from clocks to calendars to soda fountain urns. By 1895, barely 7 years after taking control, Candler could report to shareholders that Coca-Cola was sold in every single state and territory in the United States. Syrup sales had increased nearly tenfold. And Candler was just getting started. Because the real genius of Coca-Cola was never the formula. It was the franchise model. In 1899, 2 lawyers from Chattanooga, Tennessee, walked into Candler's office and asked for the exclusive rights to bottle and sell Coca-Cola across practically the entire country. Candler, who saw Coca-Cola purely as a soda fountain drink, thought the idea of putting it in bottles was ridiculous. He sold them the bottling rights for $1. That single dollar transaction accidentally created one of the most powerful distribution networks the world has ever seen. Within 20 years, there were over 1,000 bottling plants across America, 95% of them independently owned and operated. Coca-Cola didn't need to build a global infrastructure from scratch. It convinced other people to build it for them, using their own capital, their own labor, and their own local knowledge. The company supplied the syrup. The franchisees supplied everything else. It was the template that McDonald's, Subway, and 1,000 other companies would later copy. But Coca-Cola did it first. Now, by the early 1900s, there was a growing problem. The original formula still contained traces of cocaine from the coca leaf. Public pressure was mounting. Newspapers ran alarming stories. Politicians demanded action. Asa Candler quietly began removing the active cocaine compound, replacing it with a spent coca leaf extract. The part left over after the cocaine had already been chemically stripped out. The caffeine stayed, the sugar stayed. The addictive quality of the habit stayed. But the cocaine vanished from the recipe, and with it, the most dangerous controversy. What replaced it was something far more powerful than any drug: branding on a scale the world had never seen. In 1906, the bottling industry was drowning in imitators. Dozens of knockoff colas were stealing customers, and the original product had no reliable way to prove its authenticity on a shelf full of brown bottles. So Coca-Cola commissioned a competition to design a bottle so distinctive you could recognize it by touch alone in the dark, or identify it even if it was shattered on the ground. The result was the Contour bottle, that iconic curved glass silhouette that became one of the most recognized shapes on the planet. It wasn't just a container, it was a weapon against imitation, a physical trademark, and a tiny billboard that advertised itself every time someone picked it up. But the company's most brilliant psychological move was still ahead. By the late 1920s, Coca-Cola had a devastating seasonal problem. Nobody wanted an ice-cold fizzy drink in the dead of winter. Sales cratered every December. The company needed to make Coca-Cola feel warm and comforting even when the temperature outside was freezing. Their answer was a painter named Haddon Sundblom. In 1931, Coca-Cola hired Sundblom to create a version of Santa Claus for their Christmas advertising campaign. This might sound trivial now, but before Sundblom, Santa Claus had no consistent image anywhere in the world. He had been depicted as everything from a thin, stern bishop to a terrifying elf to a Norse huntsman draped in animal skins. He wore green, blue, purple, brown. There was no standard. Sundblom erased all of that. He painted a plump, rosy-cheeked, white-bearded grandfather figure in a red and white suit, colors that conveniently matched the Coca-Cola brand, holding a bottle of Coke with a twinkle in his eye and a warmth that radiated off the canvas. Those paintings ran in the Saturday Evening Post, National Geographic, and the New Yorker. They appeared on billboards, store displays, calendars, and plush dolls across the country and, eventually, the world. Sundblom continued painting Santa for Coca-Cola for over 30 years, from 1931 to 1964. And within a single generation, his Santa had erased every other version from the collective imagination. Today, when you picture Santa Claus, that specific Santa, the one with the belly laugh and the red velvet suit, you are picturing an advertisement for a soft drink company. Coca-Cola didn't invent Christmas, but they effectively trademarked its most recognizable face. And in doing so, they solved their winter problem forever. Coca-Cola didn't just sell soda in December. Coca-Cola became December. But what happened next made everything before it look like a dress rehearsal. In 1933, the same year Adolf Hitler rose to power, a 30-year-old German businessman named Max Keith took charge of Coca-Cola's operations in Germany. Keith was a force of nature, an imposing figure with a commanding presence. He terrified subordinates, but earned their absolute loyalty. Under his leadership, Coca-Cola sales in Germany exploded from 100,000 cases in 1933 to over 4 million cases by 1939. He achieved this by doing what Candler had done in America, but adapted for a very different political reality. Keith supplied massive quantities of Coca-Cola to the 1936 Berlin Olympics. He sent branded trucks to follow Hitler youth rallies through the streets. At a Coca-Cola Company anniversary party, he ordered a mass Sieg Heil salute in honor of the dictator's 50th birthday. Keith was never a member of the Nazi Party, but he understood that survival in the Third Reich meant performing loyalty, whether you felt it or not. And then the lifeline was cut. When war broke out and Allied trade embargoes severed Germany from American supplies, the flow of Coca-Cola syrup stopped entirely. By 1942, the last reserves of Coke in Germany had been rationed to wounded soldiers in military hospitals. Keith's factories were on the verge of being seized by the Nazi government, so he improvised with whatever scraps of raw material he could find: apple fiber from cider presses, whey from cheese production, beet sugar, the leftovers of leftovers, as he later described them. He gathered his team and told them to use their fantasy, their imagination. A salesman named Joe Knipp shouted back a single word: Fanta. And just like that, a new soft drink was born inside the Third Reich. Fanta sold 3 million cases in 1943 alone. German housewives used it to sweeten soups and stews when sugar was rationed. Nazi officials drank it at their desks, and Coca-Cola's entire German subsidiary survived the war without a single directive from headquarters in Atlanta. Here's what makes this chapter so uncomfortable. While Fanta was keeping the German operation alive under Nazi rule, the American parent company was simultaneously transforming itself into the most patriotic brand in the Allied war effort. In 1941, Coca-Cola President Robert Woodruff issued one of the boldest corporate directives in business history. Every American soldier in uniform would be able to buy a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, no matter where they were in the world, no matter what it cost the company. It was a staggering promise, one that would end up costing over $80 million in today's money, and it would fundamentally reshape the global beverage landscape. The U.S. military didn't just accept Coca-Cola's offer, they embraced it as a strategic asset. When General Dwight Eisenhower sent an urgent cablegram from Allied headquarters in North Africa in June of 1943, he didn't request more tanks or ammunition. He requested materials and equipment to build 10 Coca-Cola bottling plants. President Franklin Roosevelt personally granted the company a special exemption from sugar rationing, a privilege no competitor ever received. While Pepsi and dozens of other brands were strangled by wartime restrictions, Coca-Cola thrived under the government protection. The company deployed 148 employees called technical observers, nicknamed the Coca-Cola Colonels, who wore Army uniforms, held officer rank and pay, and were treated as essential military personnel. Their sole mission? Build bottling plants as close to the front lines as physically possible, and make sure no American soldier went without a Coke. And they delivered on a scale that still defies belief. 64 portable bottling plants were shipped to combat zones across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Military transport aircraft flew empty Coca-Cola bottles back to bottling facilities to be refilled, giving them the same logistical priority as spent ammunition casings. Over 5 billion bottles of Coca-Colas were consumed by military personnel during World War II. 5 billion. But the bottles were only half the story. The real conquest was the association. In the jungles of New Guinea, on the beaches of Normandy, in the rubble of newly liberated Paris, wherever American soldiers appeared as liberators, they appeared with a Coke in hand. The company ran advertisements across dozens of countries, each one showing a smiling American GI sharing a bottle with grateful locals. Written in the native language of whatever market it targeted, the message was always the same. Coca-Cola is America, and America is freedom. It was propaganda wrapped in refreshment. And it worked brilliantly, because by the time the war ended, Coca-Cola had achieved something no advertising budget on earth could ever buy. It had embedded itself into the emotional memory of an entire generation across dozens of nations, not as a consumer product, but as a symbol of liberation itself. Then came the Cold War. And the story gets even stranger. On the Allied side, Coca-Cola was now synonymous with victory and Western freedom. But in the Soviet Union, it represented everything the communist system despised: American capitalism, consumer decadence, cultural infiltration. Joseph Stalin banned it outright, but there was one man who couldn't give it up: Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the legendary Soviet war hero who had helped crush Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. Zhukov had tasted Coca-Cola during wartime meetings with American allies, and he was hooked. But drinking an American product openly in Stalin's Soviet Union could mean disgrace, exile, or worse. So Zhukov reached out through discreet channels and made an extraordinary request. Coca-Cola's response was equally extraordinary. They developed a special clear version of the drink, stripped of its signature brown color, bottled in plain, unmarked containers with a white cap and a red Soviet star, designed to look exactly like vodka. The hero of the Soviet Union could sip his secret American indulgence in plain sight, and no one would suspect a thing. Think about that. A soft drink company custom manufactured a disguised product line for a single foreign general just to maintain even a symbolic presence behind the Iron Curtain. This isn't the behavior of a beverage brand. This is the behavior of a soft power operation. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the backlash was intensifying. The French Communist Party publicly warned that Coca-Cola's distribution network was a cover for American espionage. In 1948, the French Finance Ministry tried to block Coca-Cola imports entirely, arguing the company would drain profits back to America without contributing anything to France's post-war recovery. Italians kept their distance. Austrians saw the red and white logo as a Trojan horse for American cultural values. A new word entered the European vocabulary, one that captured the anxiety of an entire continent: Coca-colonization. The fear that the United States was colonizing the world not with armies, but with consumer goods. Coca-Cola, Levi's jeans, rock and roll, Hollywood, and that every bottle sold was another inch of cultural sovereignty lost. But resistance, ultimately, was futile. Between 1947 and the early 1950s, Coca-Cola opened bottling operations in the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Italy, and France. Then Egypt, Iceland, Iran, West Africa, and New Guinea. The 64 wartime bottling plants didn't close when peace arrived. They were converted into permanent commercial facilities. By 1960, the number of countries with Coca-Cola bottling operations had nearly doubled from the pre-war era, and the company was serving hundreds of millions of drinks per day. Every military base, every supply route, every beachhead that American forces had established during the war became a potential Coca-Cola distribution point. The infrastructure of liberation had been seamlessly repurposed into the infrastructure of commerce. And that is the pattern that makes Coca-Cola unlike any other corporation in history. It didn't just sell a product. It attached itself to the most powerful forces of the 20th century: war, patriotism, liberation, Cold War ideology, cultural identity, and rode each one to a new level of global dominance. When Pemberton mixed his tonic in 1886, he was chasing a cure for pain. When Candler bought the formula, he was chasing profit. When Keith kept the factories running under the Nazis, he was chasing survival. When Woodruff sent Coke to the front lines, he was chasing an empire. And when the last battle was fought and the last treaty signed, Coca-Cola had done something no military campaign, no political movement, and no other corporation has ever fully replicated. It had made a single-flavored liquid, a specific combination of sugar, caffeine, and carbonated water, into a universal human experience, recognized in virtually every country on the planet. Today, Coca-Cola products are sold in more than 200 countries and territories worldwide. The brand is valued in the tens of billions, and the contour bottle, the Sunblom Santa, the red and white script logo. These are not just corporate assets. They are cultural landmarks, as deeply embedded in global consciousness as any national flag or anthem. But behind every sip is a history that most people never stop to consider. A history of addiction and patent medicine, of calculated propaganda and wartime profiteering, of cultural imperialism disguised as refreshment, and of a company that understood one thing better than almost anyone else in the 20th century. People don't buy products. They buy feelings. They buy identity. They buy a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. And for over 140 years, no company on earth has sold those invisible things more effectively than the one that started with a morphine-addicted pharmacist stirring chemicals in a backroom laboratory in Atlanta, Georgia.